So hello everybody, welcome. This is our third Insiders Call, super exciting. We're really happy to have all of you here. Just to give a quick rundown of the logistics, we will be sharing this recording publicly afterwards. You can use the chat throughout the hour. If you have any questions, we'll make sure to pause throughout. Make sure we answer those. The captions should be enabled as well. And so if you want to turn that on, this is also a note to me to speak slowly. I get excited and then I kind of just power through. And if you're open to having your camera on, that's wonderful as well, but no pressure if it doesn't make sense to do it right now. And then a reminder to leave support questions for the forum. We really want to focus on some of the topics we have planned for today. And so, yeah. In terms of the agenda, doing a quick intro now, I'm going to be going through the product roadmap really quickly, just to give you insight into what we're working on. Then we're going to jump into a lightning talk with Rudo Kemper, which we're really excited about. And then we're going to do a deep dive around some different techniques that you can try with entities to prevent duplicates or show a summary, which is really exciting with Alen. So that's what we have in store for today. Just to give a quick overview of the roadmap, this is public. I'm sure a lot of you have seen it before, but if you haven't, you can go to the URL there. We try to keep it up to date as best as possible. Some of the highlights, last week we released Central V 2024.1, which is super exciting, where you can add entities by uploading a CSV. We also, for ODK Cloud users, you'll now notice a little feedback button on the side, and our goal there is to give a way for folks to give contextual feedback. If something isn't working, we want to know. If things are working well, we also want to know that. So hopefully that's a little bit easier way to give feedback in the moment. And then we're also working on the collect beta, which we'll be hoping to share soon. And that's really focused on recovering data, improving line styling on a map. And then we shared about a week or so ago some of the work we're doing around offline entities and hoping to share a prototype of that soon. So we're going to jump right into the lightning talk. We're super excited to have Rudo with us. He's a geographer and technologist, has been using ODK for many years. He primarily works to support Indigenous communities all over the world, so we're really excited to hear some of the stories he has to share. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then hand it over to you, Rudo.
Awesome. Thank you, Ali. It's great to see so many people here, including some that I know, and it's great to meet everybody else for the first time. Yeah, thanks for having me. This is awesome. So, yep. Thank you, Ali, for saying most of the things that I would say here already. But yeah, a little bit about myself here. I'm a geographer and an open source developer, which I became by accident. I'll tell you a little bit about that into this talk. I'm based in the East Coast of the United States, but I'm originally from Curacao, hence the Caribbean music to kind of kick us off this morning. And yeah, a lot of my work has been in kind of supporting Indigenous communities and doing mapping and monitoring, which I'll talk a lot about. So and everybody can see my screen, right? Yeah, cool. So this was me about 10 years ago in an indigenous village in Suriname called Apatina, where I was having my very first experience introducing open data kits to some indigenous rangers that were being trained in using kind of digital technologies for mapping and monitoring. So that's somewhat younger me with no gray hairs as of yet, trying to figure out how to, customize open data kit at the time for specifically kind of geospatial data collection. That's always been kind of a focus of mine, and training people in how to use the tools. It was a project that I was with an organization called Amazon Conservation Team, which is a nonprofit based in the US, but working in South America with communities. And we got, I think, a grant from Global Forest Watch, a small grant to sort of roll out Open Data Kit essentially in 3 different villages, because at the time, you might know they have a tool called Forest Watcher for kind of monitoring, but that didn't exist yet. So we were interested in having people kind of monitor forest impacts and kind of gold mining and other things that were happening in their territories. So we had this project to roll out ODK, and that was really exciting at the time. And because for us, I think that was kind of cutting edge. The organization at the time had this workflow that they were introducing to communities to basically use handheld GPSs, which you can see in the picture here. And there's a photo of one of the villages where I was working. And the workflow was basically to write down GPS coordinates on a piece of paper, which you see on the right there. So people would go out and use handheld garments and then write down sort of UTM coordinates on a piece of paper and then have a short description of what it is that they're, mapping. And as you can imagine, leaves a lot of margin of error for when people forget one coordinate or, a number is sort of miswritten or missing, and also doesn't really leave a lot of room for describing the kind of richness of some of the information that they were encountering. I mean, it wasn't just monitoring. Sometimes it's also mapping, place names or sacred sites or places of importance that have a story attached to it and all of these kinds of things. And so they literally just had like a one-line entry. And then, of course, there's the sort of digitization of this where somebody had to manually put all this into a spreadsheet, into a CSV, and then turn it into a GeoJSON, and, a ton of kind of labor involved. So ODK was a really kind of awesome, solution at the time, which was great. And it was really fun too. It was really participatory. So we basically created surveys in the communities instead of sort of pre-baking them in advance. So with the rangers, we asked them, what is it that you want to map, right? And how do we encode that into the local language, which in this case was Wayana, and basically go through this form design process sort of iteratively, which was really cool. And yeah, so that's what it looked like at the end of it, which was really kind of awesome as a way for people to be able to have in their own language, and this was translated into a couple different languages, I think, the ability to collect data with some iconography and so on. And so that was really great. And it really improved kind of the mapping process. People really kind of felt a lot of ownership after designing their own forms, and kind of felt like this is one of their products and they're collecting data, for themselves as part of participatory mapping. And the training was a lot easier and everything. So yeah, that was really awesome. Until we got to the kind of storage and analysis phase. And some of you that are, I assume everybody here is probably knows what they're looking at. And this is ODK aggregate, I think. Not one of the ones that we use. I think I just found a screenshot online, which in and of itself is fine. I mean, in terms of it being a place where you store the data and can then download it. But for us, there was a specific kind of issue with this in terms of storage, right? Because these are communities that are in the rainforest in very kind of offline kind of locations, and or if there is internet, it's expensive, or there's a lot of timeouts. And so it kind of all worked really well when it came to the data collection, but once it came to the storage and uploading all of that, we encountered a lot of issues. And I have to say as well, as kind of a naive sort of young technologist, this was not my closet, but basically I set up an ODK Central server on a computer that was sitting in my office in Washington, D.C. And so basically data from the rainforest in Suriname was being sent all the way to the United States to be stored somewhere on a server that I had in my office. And that introduced a lot of kind of delay, essentially, where, the process for communities to basically have access to their data again in some kind of a tangible format, like a map, that you could put down as a piece of paper in the village for people to look at and actually see what's this data that you've collected, right? Basically took months. And at that point, some of the community members got a little disenchanted and frustrated, honestly, about like, hey, we're submitting this data to you that you're hosting somewhere and we're not having access to it, right? And so that led to a lot of, disappointment from the community of like, where's our data? We're collecting it, but it has to be sent somewhere. It's not sitting here in the village, and that's a problem, right? So long story short, that kind of led to me becoming sort of a developer of sorts, and kind of experimenting with technologies that can work offline. And I'm pleased to see Dan Joseph in the chat, because Dan, you might remember me talking with you a lot on Slack about figuring out if portable OpenStreetMap could be one of those solutions when it was still around, as being potentially a way for people to, have access to their data offline where they could download it from that server and so on. And also kind of had a foray into open source development. So working on different tools that work offline for communities, like Mapeo and Terra Stories. There's a few other tools that are in kind of the ecosystem, that people are using. And that's been sort of my career until now, is really working more as a developer, trying to figure out how to get tools, and really how to make sure that communities have access to their data at all times and this kind of data sovereignty point. So I've been lucky to work with a lot of communities across the world. So this is in Ecuador with the Siacopai community, who've been using kind of geospatial data collection for land rights and land titling. So it's evidence of what is their territory for demarcation to get, rights to their land. This is ODK of Mount Elgon in Kenya, who are using tools to collect data about sort of incursions into their land and monitoring impact, and also looking at how the ODK are using the forest as a way to provide testimony and evidence to their kind of continued tenure. This is actually in Canada, the First Nations community who are using, in this case, they were using Open Data Kit as well, and they were documenting impacts on dams, essentially, on the waterways, and how their river has been gradually contaminated as it goes downstream and reaches their community. And this is very recently in the Solomon Islands, where I was able to go and work with communities in Malaita to basically, do data collection about regrowth of trees, so reforestation, as well as impacts of logging. But something that I continue to struggle with, and this is across all tools, it doesn't matter what tool, is there's this issue of kind of siloing data where, you tend to download data in whatever format or tool it is. And then for communities, it kind of sits there, and it might be on a database, or it might be in a specific file format that isn't really legible or immediately useful to communities. And then there's this kind of dependency, right, on people like us to kind of be involved in processing some of that data and putting it into that format where they can actually derive insights or, use it for advocacy or whatever, right? And I feel like that's something that still is an issue and a gap and a pain point for many Indigenous communities, regardless of the tool. Like I said, they start to collect data and then they have it somewhere, but then there's no easy way for them to actually put it to use and have power over it and also have access to it. So one thing I'm working on right now that I'm really excited about is a tool called Guardian Connector, which is a tentative name. It's a working name. We're searching for a better title. But it's basically going to, well, it already is. It's being used by a few communities. But it's an integrated platform that pulls data from lots of different sources and gathers it in one place. And so it's mostly kind of backend tooling, but there's a little bit of front end as well that I'm going to show you in a second in terms of visualization. But and I won't have time to go, I don't think I have a lot of time to go into design principles, but we're really grounding what we're building in a lot of what's on here, like data sovereignty. I mentioned the importance of offline for Indigenous communities, although that's changing a bit, data source agnostic, and really trying to come up with something that's serving as permanent storage for communities now and into the future. And part of that is thinking also about tools that may not exist yet, but will in the future that we don't even know about, and making it easy for communities to plug in, their kind of data warehouse into those tools into the future as well. So this is we're still working on ways to visualize this, but it's basically like looking at the different data collection tools that are out there, which includes Open Data Kit, Kobo, Mapeo, Locus Map. There's so many. And rather than advocating for any one tool, essentially being able to pull data from all of those different tools and then having that be stored in a centralized place that the communities own. So it can be locally hosted, offline if they want to, it can be in the cloud, on the premises that they own is the important part. And then also having some visualization tools to be able to make sense of that data. So we're really looking at kind of compatibility with all of this, like I said, and not really sort of locking communities into any one tool, but being able to integrate with essentially all of what's out there, as long as it has a format that we know about and a schema. An API would be great, but if not, then potentially finding ways to also upload the data. So on the front end, we're using something called Superset by Apache, which is kind of, if you're not familiar, it's an open source. You can think of it as an open source alternative to Power BI. It's a visualization tool. It has all kinds of ways to create charts and graphs and different ways of showing your data. And for Indigenous communities, often enough, the simplest ones are the best ones, like bar graphs and charts. So essentially what we're doing is being able to pull data from places like Open ODK Central or the Kobo server, and then pulling that into a central data warehouse, and then having Superset being able to make kind of charts and graphs, of that data. So this, I think, was ODK data from sort of a survey, for a sample survey that we developed. But Superset is also a little limited where you can't do much like the kind of views that people, especially Indigenous communities, really want to see, which are not just limited to quantitative. It's also maps and kind of image galleries. Like people are really keen on seeing, the media that they've collected in the field. So we've also built out, I'm skipping ahead here, um, basically some views like a map where you can kind of filter your data and also kind of an image gallery, more of an image first perspective of the data. The reason I said I'm skipping ahead here is because it's been really interesting to work with communities on using this tool because they're using it for data that they're currently collecting, but also a bunch of legacy data that they've collected in the past. So when I was in the Solomons, actually, somebody came to me and said, "Hey, we did this ODK project like 4 or 5 years ago and collected thousands of points about trees that we're planting. Would it be possible to integrate this?" And we said, "Sure, of course. Let's pull that data in." And so they now have kind of a visualization that's custom, to what they're interested in about what kind of species of trees that they plant, how many per month, kind of a heat map, and then also sort of a map view where you can click on each point, that has a geospatial reference and being able to see all of the survey data on the left-hand side there that was collected about it. And then the same thing in a kind of a gallery format. So it's data agnostic, but often enough, the tools that people are using is XLS form. So either ODK or Kobo, is the most common tools that Indigenous communities use, especially if it's non-geospatial data collection, but also geospatial. And so in this case, we're using it for those data sources, but it could also be used for anything else, basically, that has, in this case, an image attached to it, or for that matter, video or audio. And in this case, of a map, geospatial. So that's one of the things we're doing. And the other thing I really wanted to talk about, which has to do with entities, as a matter of fact, is a kind of a monitoring workflow that we're developing for communities. And that's a current grant that we have from the Skull Foundation, where basically what we're doing is generating near real-time alerts about specific activities that are taking place in Indigenous territories. So, you might know like Global Forest Watch, they have GLAD alerts, which are just kind of general global data set of deforestation writ large, but not really specifically what kind of deforestation, right? So we're working to generate kind of bespoke alerts about activities like gold mining or logging and kind of filtering those out and then serving those to communities on a dashboard. And I'm talking very near real time. So as soon as imagery becomes available, Sentinel or Landsat, we generate these alerts. They show up on this kind of dashboard view where people can have the ability to sort of explore before and after images. And this is all kind of algorithmically set up to be automated, and then downloaded in various formats, and then hopefully be able to then kind of collect data upon it. So one of the tools we're actually generating, which might be interesting too, is a way to generate offline maps in MBTiles format from different sources. That includes kind of like Planet Monthly based maps or Bing Maps or kind of a Mapbox map, and then basically generate that so you can use that in really any of the data collection tools because they all support raster MBTiles. And the idea then is then people can collect data when they go out into the field about the different alerts that they're seeing, right? So if it's a gold mining site, you may want to go on an expedition to capture evidence from the ground to be able to have kind of two different forms of evidence of what is happening in your territory, right? And so people have done that. And here's an example of that where somebody has using Mapeo in this case, but it could also be with ODK. And it's selected, so that's why it's yellow, but otherwise it'd be a blue point, collected data about gold mining activity once they've gone on a river expedition. And that's now showing on this dashboard in addition to remote sensing. And the next thing we're then working on is being able to generate ways to export this data. So as a map to be able to provide evidence or perhaps as a template, to be able to kind of denounce or share with stakeholders like the government that something is happening, in their territory if they have land rights to it, or if it's kind of extractive activities that are outside of a concession area. Like you can actually see that in this case where there's kind of mining activity that goes beyond the boundary of a concession that's been given out. So it's actually illegal. And then this is a way for communities to have access to information to report on that or, share it. So entities is, I think, really interesting because I think what's happening here is that we have shapes, right? We have kind of GeoJSON of alerts, and it would be awesome to collect data upon those alerts as they come in. Or even just more generally, I think for monitoring, there's this use case where, something new is encountered in the field, that you want to continue to monitor over time. So for communities, it might be an oil spill, it might be a new gold mining site, it might be logging or just any kind of incursion. And you want to see what happens 6 months from now, right? What are the impacts? Is it still there? And right now, communities often find themselves just creating many different points about the same thing, but having no easy way to relate it together about being the same kind of, again, entity is the best word for it. So to us, I think monitoring, yeah, like entities is something really interesting for monitoring. I'd love to explore that more and just see where that journey goes. But also specifically for our workflow, where we're generating these objects in GeoJSON or it could be CSV, can we then pass that to somebody who's using ODK in the field to be able to collect data upon it? So it's not just a point that is sort of sitting nearby, the alerts as we have them on this dashboard, but actually about them. So yeah, so that's kind of where I'd like to end. I know I don't have a lot of time, and that was a lot of information, but I'd love to see if there's any questions. Remaining difficulty is just like the completely offline context. As I mentioned at the very beginning, in terms of ODK Central, for example, of needing to have access to a server that actually, is able to serve the alerts to you. But I mean, in 2024, honestly, I don't know if you know this, but in like the Brazilian Amazon and pretty much everywhere, all the communities I work with are suddenly finding themselves with a Starlink. And that's something new that we're thinking about too, that maybe the offline problematic isn't as severe as it used to be, since now everybody seems to have access to Elon Musk technology, for better or worse, with all the implications of what that entails. But it is something new that we're taking note of. Yeah, that was probably a lot, so I'm happy to sort of end there and see if anyone has questions. Thank you.
Thank you. That was awesome.
Thank you. Does anyone have any quick questions before we hand it over to Alen? That was wonderful. We can also continue the conversation on the forum as well.
I did see one question from
Oh.
Dan about backups.
Mm.
So asking local means like a local server, not just an in-country cloud provider. Do you address data backups, a cloud copy, multiple hard drives? How do you think about that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question, Dan. Thank you. So it does mean kind of like locally hosted. So as in there's a computer upon which the server and the infrastructure is being hosted. And in that case, your question is super important and critical. And the first thing that we do at the outset is just kind of counsel on pros and cons. Some communities have very strict requirements about where their data sits. Many communities are kind of comfortable with the cloud and, are fine with maybe either it being on kind of a green host type server that has like better privacy than AWS or GCP or whatever. But some communities that I've worked with are like, no, we want our data to be in territory, like physically here. I want it to be this tangible thing that I know it's there and I can turn it on and off and can control who has access to it. In which case, yeah, you have obviously these issues of potential hardware failure, or somebody steals the device or runs off with it, or humidity or what have you. So currently we don't, but it's like top of our roadmap for the next proposal to come up with some kind of guardrails against that, of being able to do backups that are periodically made. We haven't scoped that out yet. If anyone has experience with that, I'd love to talk with you, actually. I'm imagining from the hot space, Dan, that there's probably lots of thinking about that already, of how to do that and how to just, yeah, do that in an efficient and cost-effective way. It is something we're thinking a lot about. And as of this moment, we're just counseling communities of like, listen, if you do want to host it locally, here's the pros and cons. And the biggest con you should know about is this failure thing. And in fact, in the Solomons, people really wanted it in the clouds, because of cyclones and kind of typhoons that happen there all the time, which wash everything away. And so for them, they're like, no, please put it in the cloud, because if we have it here, it's going to break and then we lose all of our data. It's happened before, So in the first instance, it's just a conversation, but also we'd like to do better. And if anyone has ideas, I'd love to talk.
And then one quick question from Odile about the mechanism for connecting Central and Superset.
Yeah, so on the back end, we're using kind of a pub sub mechanism that we're currently rebuilding, as a matter of fact. But essentially, we have an API integration, right? So for the ODK Central API, we have a mechanism that pulls it on a regular interval and then pulls in that data kind of dynamically, and structures it into a SQL database. We also store files as they come in, kind of on a data lake thing. So if there's any kind of binary like media that's also stored. And then we use the kind of properties to be able to create the link, to be able to render an image on the front end and things like that. So we're trying to be as like high fidelity as possible and not doing any kind of data transformations, and also pulling in metadata from the ODK Central. The idea being like 50 years from now, somebody might not know the provenance of this data, right? So we're trying to also have as much possible to be able to make sense of the original source of this data. So long answer, but basically, yeah, we're using the ODK API, to be able to regularly pull and collect new data and update it if it's been updated. And
Wonderful.
I should say, sorry, I was going to say just quickly, like right now, it's not for reasons of like who started working on it. It's a private repo, but it's going to be free and open source soon. So it's something that we can share if that's helpful to anyone.
That's great. Yeah, we love Superset. It is a wonderful tool. Well, thank you so much, Rudo. Really appreciate you taking the time to kind of go through some history and also talk about some of the new things in ODK and how that might fit into some of the work that you're doing. Really, really appreciate it. Um, Now we're going to go in a completely different direction, if you all are okay with that, and sort of take it where Rudo left off and do a little bit of a deep dive on some of the mechanics of how we could use entities. And I'm going to try to relate it to some of what he was talking about. I promised y'all we're going to focus on two areas that are of interest for using entities. One is preventing duplicates. So things like somebody's already reported the problem 17 times. Maybe we don't need to report it one more. This is an issue if you're just doing data collection completely independent of each other. Let's say that 17 people just happen to walk by the problematic gold mine, they're just going to report it over and over and over again, right? So entities give us a way to feed back some data about what's already been captured. And I'll show you some techniques for helping to avoid duplicates. And then the other thing that I'm going to show and talk about a little bit is how we can use entities to show a summary of what's been going on. So again, thinking about what some of Rudo was talking about, if you want to have consumable data in the field, one of the things you can do is just have it right back in the form. So have some kind of summary right there where a user is capturing data. You can also have some information about what else has been captured by other people, by themselves over time, segmented in different ways. So that's my game plan. Does that sound reasonable to everybody? Awesome. Let us do it. So I'm going to share my screen here. And so this is my deep dive. And I always like to look at you all. So if you want to keep your cameras on, that's helpful to me. I could see your reactions and adjust accordingly. If anything is just too fast or you're not following, please give me an emoji or give me a frown and I'll adjust accordingly. Um, so I want to start by talking about how we got here, and how we got to entities. Some of you have seen this slide before, but I think it's important. So we've heard a lot of user requests from people like Rudo, from others, of like, hey, I wish my form could access all of the submission data on a device. I wish I could show a summary of data that's been collected. I wish I could link two forms together so that they can access each other's data. I wish I could link all of the submissions about the same subject, like as Rudo said, so it's not just a dot that sort of happens to be near the polygon, but so that they're actually connected. I want to, I have a list of things, a list of places, a list of problems that have been reported. I want to share them between forms. I want to flow submissions from one form into another. So these are kind of examples of different words that people have used to express their wishes that ODK could do over time. And we kind of looked at all of these and said, okay, really what you all are talking about is you have multiple step workflows where at some point data is being collected about entities, and then later on some action is being taken, and then that process may repeat multiple times. That has always been possible with ODK, but with some manual steps, right? You have to like download your data from one form and maybe upload it to another form. Not very satisfying, not very real time also. And so looking at all of these requests, we said, all right, can we do a unified solution that's going to address all of these needs? Not exactly as people have described them, right? It's not exactly flowing data from one form to another, but it's providing that ability by having this new concept of entities that are shared between forms. We've tried to make this as non-disruptive as possible, so everything that you know about forms is still relevant. We've added on entities on top of that. So the big idea is that entities help automate workflow. So hopefully that's kind of the picture that you have when you think about entities. An entity, like Rudo said, is kind of very natural, right? It's just a thing. It's a fancy word for thing. So whatever thing you have that you want to collect data about, you can make that into an entity in the ODK world. It could be physical, like an actual tree. It could be an abstract, like a suggestion or a problem that has been identified. Those can all be different types of entities. And we organize entities in lists. So you kind of have your tree entity list, your suggestion entity list. So entities track state over time. The last follow-up update, something that has happened. While the forms continue to be really important, they're going to be defining the behavior. So you can think about the entities as your nouns and your forms as your verbs, right? They need to operate together. And you can use many entity lists within a form. So that's another kind of part of the magic here is you may have lots and lots of different types of data that come together within a form, and then you can act upon all of that data. You don't have to have highly updating entity lists. You can also have some data that rarely changes, like maybe location names. And you can have that shared between your forms so that if you do need to add a location, you don't have to go to every single form and add that. You can have a list that's shared. So that's kind of the high level mental model that hopefully everybody has about entities. You can think of a big CSV in the cloud. You can think of a shared database. That's the kind of thing that entities let you do. So should you use entities? I think this is a really important question to ask. It's easy to get really excited and say, okay, there's this new stuff the ODK team's been working on. I should definitely use it. If you have a process that works well today, I would generally say, don't change it. Things that work are worth a whole lot, a lot more than things that are new. So be mindful of that. If you have an annoying, slow, or error-prone process, that's where I would say, okay, yes, now it's time to try entities. Does your workflow have clearly defined separate phases? So are you capturing data about your original entities, in January, and then you need to follow up with them in June? Well, in that case, maybe you don't need to have data flowing directly between those two stages. Maybe it's okay to just have the data from January, download it, process it, and reattach it to your June form. But in a lot of cases, that's not what's happening, right? Somebody's collecting new information about problems, about gold mines that are problematic, and then somebody else needs to be following up on that in real time. That's a really good context for using entities. Last kind of point I would say is if you have some data that needs to be shared between forms and updated, that's another good context for using entities. I bring all of these things up because entities are really cool. They give you a lot of power, but they do add complexity. If you think about it, right, we're sharing data between forms. It can be updated at any time. It's highly dynamic. It's a lot less predictable. It's going to be harder to test your form. So you really want to make sure that it's worth it for your workflow before you start, adding this. If you have something that works, great. Now, let's say that you have decided that you want to use entities. One of the challenging bits about this is how to access them. I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this already. I know a lot of you have written entity forms. So I want to do an overview of how to access entities. That's going to be key to preventing duplicates and showing a summary. And hopefully this will give you a little bit stronger mental models, even if you're already using these techniques. So this is how do you actually say, okay, I have this big old entity list. I want to access a specific one. These expressions are what you're going to be using. So this is a list lookup expression, and it's a lot to look at first. But hopefully I'll convince you in the next few minutes that it's extremely powerful and that anybody can write them either by pattern matching a little bit or by really understanding what's going on. This is an example of an expression that's going to give us the visits that have happened at a certain place. So you can see the first part says instance people. People is my list of entities. And then I have root item, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And in square brackets, you have a filter. So you're saying, I want to consider every person connected to a place called place, and you know the curly brace notation means that that's another question in the form. So I've already captured a place in my form. I want to filter my people based on who's in that place. And then I want to get all of the visits related to that. I could do something with that. We'll look at some more useful expressions in the context of summaries and duplicates. Now, here again, we've got your entity list, we've got a filter. This is exactly the same as a choice filter. And then at the end, we say which property that we want. Some of you have used pull data. It's very similar to pull data. It's just a little bit more general. So you can look at the equivalent pull data expression down here. So we're saying pull from a source called people. What do we want to pull? We want to pull visits. We want to do that by using the place column or property, and we want to compare that against the place that was in the form. So these are, as I've written them, they're exactly analogous. I find pull data is hard to remember. I think once you've seen a few of these list lookup expressions, you'll see that they have a certain shape to them. But if you really want to use pull data, that will also work with entities. Right now, they are represented a little bit differently in terms of what like collect or enquete are doing, but soon we'll combine them. All right. I want to take a moment to just talk a little bit about what is going on when you have these list expressions. I think, again, having a mental model here can help. So the big picture is when the collect or enquete is representing all of these entity lists or choice lists, these are all the same as far as the computer's concerned. It thinks of them each as an instance of a list. Okay, so an instance of a list, instance is also a fancy word for kind of just like one of them. So when you use the instance function, you're just saying, here, the instance that I want, it's the one called people, it's the one called places. So you can think about the computer having this internal representation. Here I have an instance called places, and each list row is an item which is connected to a root. So the computer's representation is not like a list, like a spreadsheet. It's like this. Computer people are weird. We call this tree a tree, and the root is, you can see at the top rather than at the bottom. Don't worry about why, but that's what's going on. It's kind of this branching structure, and each item is connected to a root. So that's what the root item part means. It's okay if you just kind of memorize it, but I wanted to show it real quick so some of you would have this mental model. Let's go through a couple of examples of useful expressions and what that looks like in terms of what the computer is doing. So you can see here, I've got two instances, one called places, one called people. So they represent two different types of things, separate entity lists. If I want to look something up in the places entity list, I start by saying instance places, so the instance that I want is the places instance. Root item, meaning get all of the items, filter those items, those are the square brackets, where the enumerator is 6,234. Okay, so the computer's going to go through and say, this first one, is it 6,234? Is it? Okay, it has an enumerator property, 6,234. Yes, it is, right? So we're going to keep that one in the kind of set of entities that we're going to return. The second one, does it have an enumerator number of 6,234? No, so it's not going to be part of what I get back, right? So it's just going to go through and do that filter for every single item. And then it's going to do the last part of the expression, the slash label, to give you back the property that you want. So this is how we end up with Ifidore as the label that we were seeking, because there's only one item with enumerator number 6,234. So hopefully that's kind of giving you a little bit of a stronger picture here in your head. Let's do just like a couple more, okay? Because this is really going to help you understand what I show you about duplicates and summaries. Okay, let's say that we want to count the number of places with a population greater than 300,000. We can do that with these kinds of expressions. I don't think we can do this with poll data. It is possible that it can be done, but I wouldn't know how. So if one of you knows, you can show me the equivalent. What we're going to do here, again, is say, which instance do I want? I want the places instance. I want to go through every single item, so that's the root item. And I want to look for a population that's greater than 300,000. So it doesn't have to be an exact match. It could be something like, yeah, greater than. It could be any kind of function you can call inside of that filter expression. And then here I'm taking account of that whole result. And so that's going to go through every single item and say, is the population greater than 300,000? For the first one, it's not, so that's not part of my result. For the second one, oh, yes, it is. It's going to put it part of the result, and then it's going to add up all of those populations. Sorry, it's going to count all of the ones that we had there. So you can imagine that could be a really nice summary, right? Maybe in some cases, in some of the workflows that Rudo was talking about, it's useful to know how many how many trees were surveyed over time. This kind of expression can give you this. How many trees over a certain height? How many gold mine sites that are highly dangerous? You know, you can use any kind of expression in that filter and then count how many match the filter. Here's another example. Maybe I want to know how many visits there have been made to people who were visited more than once. The total number of visits. Okay, so which instance do I want to look into? Not places, I want to look into the people instance. Again, I want to filter each item. I want to see which have had more than one visit. Not the first one, but yes, the second one. I want to get all of those visits and sum them up. And that's a kind of expression I could also use as a summary or something like that. Okay, another one that I think is going to be really interesting to some of you. If you have multiple entity lists, you can link them. So here we see that in places, places has a name. That's the unique identifier given by central. People also has a place property, which has the same identifier as the place name. So maybe I want to know all of the visits that have happened in a certain place that was selected in my form. So my expression, again, I'm going to say, I want the instance called people, the entity list called people. I want to filter all of my items based on the place property. I want to have all the ones whose place is the same as the place that was selected in the form. I want to grab all the visits, and then I want to sum those up. How's that feeling? Do you feel like these expressions are kind of have a predictable rhythm to them? I know a lot of you have written them before, but maybe for some of you for whom it's less familiar, are you feeling like, okay, I can see this? I'm going to anticipate some questions that some of you may have. One, well, can't you make these easier to write? Feels like there's a lot of boilerplate. There's the root item thing. Yes, this is something that we are thinking about, and we want your feedback on as well. So let us know if there's certain types of expressions you find yourself writing a lot, and you're like, I just wish there was a shortcut. We have some ideas in mind for things like last save. Last save actually is an instance expression. Shh. It actually is an instance expression, but in XLS form, we let you write it as $ curly brace last save hash something. But that gets translated to an instance expression. There's a special instance called last save. So we're going to work on doing something like this to try to help some of these common expressions. So again, if you're seeing common expressions and you're like, it's getting tedious, Ellen, do something about this, let us know. It is something we want to work on. Another question, is this the relational database? you can definitely think of entity lists as joinable tables. You're in charge of doing your kind of own linking. Under the hood, there's a lot more complexity because we allow you to like do edits. We're not actually storing each property as a column table, but I think it's a really great mental model to have. Okay, you could think of each entity list as a table if that's helpful to you. And then you can use that concept to write your forms to design your entity lists. Another question I bet some of you have, because I know some of you know SQL, at least Rudo does for sure. You might be wondering, why not use SQL? Some of us know it. Yes, but other people don't. It's also hard and not familiar across the board. And it turns out that I was just showing you, these are called XPath expressions. And that query language, you don't know it, but you're using it every single time you do a $ curly brace expression. Those $ curly brace expressions get expanded to an expression that accesses something, a value in the form. Okay. So you're already using it. We've just given you some ways to make it a little bit easier. And like I said, we're going to try to make it easier across the board. Okay. Whew. That was a lot. Does anyone have a quick question before I show you how we're going to use these concepts to avoid duplicates and to show summaries? I see some chatter in the chat. Anything I should react to? Want to have more in the docs? Yes. So part of the reason that I wanted to put together these examples is if you tell me that they're useful, I'll put them in the docs. So let me know. If there are more that you think we should add, also let us know.
Another question is, go ahead.
No, just a quick question. So in this case, when you have entities, you can create different entities, and then like each entity is a CSV and or a table, and then in a form you can access each one of them to search between them and use data from the one and do a search based on a variable in the other one, like you show with the places and people example, right?
Exactly. So as long as you put some common value into entity lists, then you can
Okay.
relate them later on in your forms. So you can imagine you can do some pretty amazing things like that. A common way to kind of do the relationship is you might first already have a list of places that you know about, right? You might have a question where you pick a place, and then when you enter in data about a person, that place gets saved as one of the properties. And so that way later on, you can have a different form where you select a place and you show all of the people associated with that place. Or, you know, the problematic gold mines or the trees or whatever it is.
Alan, can you talk a little bit about the difference between this approach and the approach that's in COBOL of like dynamic data attachments, like flowing data directly? Like why didn't we do that?
Why have the entity concept? Why not directly flow data from one form to another? The main reason, well, there are two main reasons. One is so that we can do updates. So there's something, the mental model of being able to update an entity is very strong. If you don't have an entity concept, you just have a lot of forms and their submissions. If you want to update a value related to a thing, you need to do a pretty complicated calculation in your follow-up form to kind of like compress data over time. You know, if there are multiple forms that can update a value, say like the status of a gold mine, if you want to find the latest status, you need to compress all of that to get the latest one. And that may be quite difficult or impossible if it's coming from different forms. So that was the primary driver. There also just a lot of nice things that you can do with like selecting the entity. It gives us an easy way also to like select which properties are going to be part of the entity rather than all of the submission data. We wanted to try to make this as portable as possible. So everything that defines entities is in the same form definition that people are familiar with. Usually, if you want to do something like flow data directly from one form to another, you need to do something like on the server define which fields of the form are going to be flowed. So those are some of the two major reasons. And lots of other things, like we want to eventually make it possible to have entity ownership. And if we just have submissions that relate to an entity, that there's more indirection there. So that was a question on entity office hours last month, and I want to write a little bit more about it as well. So now let me get to the meat in the remaining 6 minutes. Let's talk a little bit about how we're going to use these ideas to prevent duplicates. The concept is we are going to attach the same entity list that we are going to be writing to our form. So if we have a registration form that's going to be creating new entities, we're going to attach that same entity list back to the form, and we're going to compare the registration data that a user is entering to the existing list that we have. And then we can warn or we can error if there's a match. So I'm going to go through these quickly, but the slides will be up. We're going to expand this in docs. I mean, I think the key thing was if you now have a better mental model of how these expressions are written, you're in great shape. You can be really creative about what you can do with entities. All right, so let's say you have a unique ID to match on. You're going to filter based on that value, that ID. You're going to count the matches. And if there's more than one match, that means the thing has already been registered, right? That makes sense. So here's the kind of expression that we might look at. If we have an instance called people, we might say, is the ID of each item in my people instance the same as the ID that the user has just entered in the form? We count all of those. And let's say we want to do a constraint, in which case are we like, we can't move forward. It's going to be if we have more than one, right? Sorry, if we have more than zero. If we have more than zero, that means that we don't want to go forward. So this is the kind of expression that we would write if we want to write a constraint. In the case of a constraint, the constraint is on the field that the user is entering their value in, right? So if they're entering the student ID, we could put a constraint on that, which checks the people or the student entity list. And if we don't have a count of exactly 0, we can't move forward. We have to do a little bit of extra things here. We have to use the current in order to use the value of the field that the user is entering in. This is just a formula that you can use. You can copy it. You can try it. I'll share this full form as well. We can also do a soft constraint, a warning. In that case, we would have a second field. So this is actually a little bit easier. Probably I should have put this one first. I'll do that next time. And this one's a little bit easier because it's a second field that we're going to use to check against that ID. And so we have a relevance condition on that second note. And we could say if the count of the people that have a matching ID is greater than 0, then we show this warning. But maybe for some reason it's okay, and then we can let the user continue even if they do have a match. Sometimes we don't have a unique ID. And I think that's going to be the case in a lot of the situations that Rudo mentioned, for example, right? Like when you walk up to a gold mine, it's not like, hello, I am gold mine 752. Sometimes it is, but often not. What you might do in that kind of case is show the list of existing entities. Like here are all of the problems that have been reported by the community. Some of you have looked at our problem reporting tutorial in the documentation. This is exactly what we do. We say, here are all of the things that have been reported. In that case, we show them on a map. Here we can show them on a list. You can search that and you can yourself make a decision. Oh, actually, it's already been registered. I don't need to do this again. Or, okay, it's not registered yet. I need to add it. So there's lots of options that you have in this case. It's not as straightforward as having a constraint, but there's still lots of good options. I've put some notes here. I'm going to invite you to look at them because I just want to take one quick second to talk about some work summary things, and then we will adjourn for now. Same kind of concept. We attach whatever entity lists we want that represent completed or target work. We can have lots of them attached. We filter based on some relevant value, maybe the enumerator, the location, And then we can show counts, show sums, and any other computed values. I bet a lot of you have done this kind of thing with repeats. The idea is now you can do the same thing, but instead of having all of the data in the form, you can have that data coming in from entity lists. Here are some examples that are going to be in the form. So we can filter by enumerator, filter by place. We can have a qualitative message, that's going to say, yay, let's keep working towards our goal, something like that. Again, a couple of notes and warnings. I'm going to expand on that in the docs. So that last part was super fast, but again, hopefully it gives you some orientation towards some of the things that you can do with entities. We're going to put all of this in the documentation. Give us feedback if there were particular examples that were more helpful or that you want further worked out. We can do that. And we'll of course share this recording as well as the slides and the sample form on the forum. So with that, a few things coming up related to this. I told you already, adding it to the documentation. Offline entities in Collect will allow you to detect duplicates and show summaries offline for a single person, right? So it doesn't, there's no magic, so it's not going to be able to tell you the work that other people have done, but it can give you a summary of your own work. It can help make sure that you're not registering the same thing multiple times. So that can be very helpful in contexts where things are very dynamic and you might not remember, like, have I already seen this? I don't know. And then also, like I said, we're going to try to work to make those queries more approachable. So that's it for a very quick overview of how we can solve some common problems with entities. We are also going to put a quick feedback survey just generally on how your experience with Insiders has been going on the forum. So please, please, please answer that if you can. Our next call is going to be June 5th at the same time. And I'm going to announce 2 entity office hour sessions coming up over the next couple of weeks. With that, I think that's our time. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Really appreciate you. Really appreciate you, Rudo. That was really great.